All right, we're live. My name is Jamie J. I am the CEO and founder of Bottleneck Virtual Assistants, and this is Live with Bottleneck. We're not here to talk about me. We're not here to talk about Bottleneck. We are here to learn different ways that you can stop the bottleneck in your business. So join us in about 38 seconds as we bring on our special guest today, Celeste Headlee. So stay tuned. We'll be right with you. Well, we're here. It's Live with Bottleneck. And I got to start. I have never had a comment this early. And the amazing Tom Schwab says, the amazing Jamie J. Tom, thank you so much. I appreciate you. I love you a lot, buddy. Let's catch up. But I am super stoked today. One of the things that I love about this platform, about live streaming, is the ability to carry on a good conversation when talking with these amazing guests, because there's a lot of pressure on me. I guess I put it on myself, but it's really important that when I say stop the bottleneck in your business, I want to bring people on that will really help you create different avenues of not being the bottleneck, of getting out of your own way. And one of the greatest things that I've ever done in my entire life was start a podcast. I would not be where I'm at today had I not started with that podcast. And now the live streaming, I just absolutely love it. It's a lot of fun. And I'm so excited to be talking today with Celeste Headlee. And she's doing a new webinar training on how to interview. Now, why should you be paying attention right now? Well, let me tell you, Celeste Headlee is an award-winning journalist, a professional speaker, and 20-year veteran of NPR and public media, and author of Do Nothing. This, if you know me at all, this is right up my alley. Do Nothing, how to break away from overworking, overdoing, and underliving. And we need to talk how to have conversations that matter. That's what I do for a living. This is so awesome. She serves as an advisory board member of procon.org and the Listen First Project, and is the co-host for the Scene on Radio podcast Men and the PBS series Retro Report. Her TEDx Talk sharing 10 ways to have better conversation now has over 20 million views, I think, to date, as of this happens. So I am so excited, and I cannot wait. Without any further ado, please allow me to introduce you to Celeste Headlee. Celeste, thank you so freaking much for jumping on this call today. This is going to be so much fun.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I literally just got off the air with an NPR show called 1A and scooted over to my computer to do this. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for being on here. For those that may not know who Celeste Headlee is, I wonder if maybe you can give a little bit of background, and then I want to talk about interviewing and how to do better job of having conversations.
Yeah, so I have been with NPR and PBS, as you said, for over 20 years. I was a correspondent for a while, reporter, then correspondent, and I've been a host for a long time. I hosted a show called The Takeaway. I was the bench reporter at NPR for quite some time, hosting things like Talk of the Nation and Weekend Edition and Tell Me More. And so I've been doing interviews, thousands and thousands of interviews, and the book writing has been recent. It's been within the past 5 or 6 years.
Congratulations, first of all, for writing a book. I'm still trying to write my first one. It is not easy, and I would take my hat off. My hair's a mess, but hats off to you for getting those out there, because we need to hear what you have to say. That is obvious.
Thanks. I mean, I will say, when I was at the publishers, because when you're selling a book, you go to all the different publishers to, have your conversations. And The fact that I was a journalist was a big selling point, because I know how to meet deadlines. They knew that I had been meeting deadlines for 20 years, so they felt a little more comfortable.
So when you finally, so you went the publisher route, you didn't do self-publishing.
So the very, very first book I wrote was only for broadcasters. It was called Herd Mentality. That's HEARD, Mentality. And that one I self-published because I wanted to make it as cheap as possible for all the public radio journalists in the world.
And get it out there right away, I suppose.
Right. The second two, the ones that you listed off, We Need to Talk and Do Nothing, those I went through your publisher.
Nice. And I know this isn't what we're here to talk about today. I'm just interested in this. How was that experience?
It's good. You know, it's the book world is this whole, it's its whole ecosystem, right? Like, so, and stop me if I'm getting into too much detail because all this was totally new for me when I did my first book. So
Absolutely not.
You create this book proposal, which honestly took almost as long to do as the book. Like the book proposal, especially for your first book, is super complex and difficult. And then your agent sends it out to all these different publishers and they'll hear back from the ones that might be interested, right? And if they're really interested, they'll set up a meeting with you, an in-person meeting. And so you spend the day walking around New York, going from one publisher to another publisher to another publisher. And you're in these meetings. A couple times when it was a small publisher, you're in a meeting with like one person. But most of the time there's a room full of people, like somewhere between 6 and 12 people. And they're asking you questions, and you know, you're supposed to be quizzing them as much as they're quizzing you to try and see if it's a good fit. And the first time I went through that, I highly recommend to authors who've never been through that before, find out what questions to ask. Because I had no idea how to determine who was the right publisher other than I liked them or I didn't like them, right? So yeah, I highly recommend that you figure out what are the questions I need to be asking. Because I changed publishers, not because I didn't like the first ones, but for other reasons. My first book was published by a Harper Collins imprint, and the second one went through Penguin Random House. So it was surreal. It was weird.
Yeah. Yeah. Holy cow. Well, congratulations to you. That's a big deal and a huge accomplishment. And Raina is here. She wanted to make sure she said hello. Hi, Raina. To you. If you have any questions for Celeste as we go through this, please, I encourage you to ask questions. If for some reason you're watching this on the replay or you just didn't know what you wanted to ask until later on, ask the questions, post it in the comment section, whether you're on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, anywhere, and I'll make sure to forward that off to Celeste so that you can get the questions answered. I'm coming back to this, Celeste. I mean, I'm sitting here talking to you, and you pretty much wrote the book interviewing questions, at least the webinar. I'm wondering, what are some of the main things that people maybe need to look out for when they start interviewing? And I'm going to say interviewing kind of lightly, because there's an interview style and then there's more of a dialogue, a conversational style. I tend to not like the interview style. I don't like the speed rounds and all of that stuff. It seems impersonal to me. I kind of like to have conversations. Like it's just you and me, and listeners are kind of flies on the wall. I don't know. I mean, I may be totally off base, but that's just me.
You're not off base. It's just that that's still an interview. An interview is a conversation in which is one in which you're exchanging information. An interview is a situation in which you're extracting information, right? So you and I are not going to be exchanging too much information. You're over the course of this extracting information from me. And you can do that in a variety of ways. You can be more conversational as you like to do, or you can do those rapid fire rounds. Those rapid fire rounds rarely get any insightful information. They're mainly for entertainment purposes. But they're still interview styles, right? You're still trying to get information from me. The thing I would like people to know most is that the vast majority of people, think that good interviews happen by magic. That when something goes wrong, it's that the guest maybe wasn't ready or was hostile or aggressive or was shy or didn't talk too much or it was a bad day or there were technical problems. But when something goes really, really well, we think it was magic. Something clicked. It's not magic. interviewing is a technique and a skill, and skills can be learned. Something occurred differently in that interview that you thought was magic that didn't occur in those ones that went poorly. And this is true of whether it's on a podcast or if you're the one chosen to lead a panel discussion at your work, or you're doing a live stream for your work, or you're at a conference and you're part of a panel or leading a panel. Regardless of what the interview is, it is technique and skill that is going to make the difference between a bad interview and a good one.
That's really insightful. So I had about 3 questions that popped into my mind when you were talking about that. But I think the third one is the one that I think I'm going to ask next. What do you say? Like, I mean, I have you on today. I love having conversations, interviews, as you say, where I'm trying to extract information out through conversation. But sometimes I feel like, who am I to be sitting here talking to Celeste Headlee, interviewing her? Like, I feel almost imposter syndrome, if you may. And I've done, hundreds and hundreds of interviews, nowhere close to what you've done, but I've been doing this about 7 years. So I've never had any formal education, which I can't wait for your webinar. I've never had any formal education with that, but I just love talking to people. And bringing you on today, there's certain things that many people do to prepare, but a lot of people prepare in different ways. And I was sitting there thinking, like, oh man, what am I going to ask Celeste? Like, she's going to be grading me the whole time I'm talking to her. Who am I to be? What the heck? And then I thought, you know what? I want to get this out there and share it with others. So, what do you say to people that feel like they may not? That.
Look, I feel imposter syndrome too. Imposter syndrome is one of those things that is almost universal if you're not a sociopath, right? So all of us feel that we're going to get found out. Sometimes I equate it to, like, in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Like, I feel like at any moment someone's going to be like, "Oh, you don't belong. You don't know what you're doing." It is totally okay to feel imposter syndrome, and you just move past it. You acknowledge it. You say, "Oh, yeah, I feel insecure, and now let me get back to the prep work of getting ready for this interview." It's not just you in terms of training, right? Like, the first published book, We Need to Talk, the reason that book came into being was because when I was hosting the Takeaway out of New York, I wanted to get better at interviews. And so I started doing research. Number one, there's almost no good advice on interviewing. There's tons of advice on how to do well in a job interview. There is almost no really good advice on how to be a better just interviewer. And so then I started researching conversations, and I when I did that, the advice that I was given was horrible. And the reason I know that the advice that we've been given so long is bad is because I tested it out. I mean, you know what it's like. Like, when you're in a studio, I could take that advice of, like, maintain eye contact, right? And I could test it. I would say, okay, I'm going to spend the next 2 weeks maintaining eye contact, and we'll see if the interviews improve. Well, they didn't. It was horrible because, of course, if you're staring into somebody's eyeballs, it's it's awkward. It's upsetting. Weird. It is. You feel like they're a serial killer. Like, it's always going to be bad. And so each particular piece of advice, say and nod your head. I tested every single one of them and then threw them out because they were baloney. And so then I had to start from scratch. So you could say kind of that even my whole career in terms of training this stuff came out of a dearth of information. Right? It's not just you, it's all of us. There's not a lot of good training in this. And frankly, the reason I'm starting the webinar training is because I've been training people how to interview at NPR and in public media for over a decade.
Oh, wow.
And I realized that there's nothing like that in the regular world. I mean, for commercial people, just available to everybody. And so I was able to adapt. I finally, because of the pandemic, had the time to adapt adapt it.
This is the blessing that came out of the pandemic. Like, I don't want to look at any good thing, but if there is something good to come out of it, a lot of us had time to kind of focus on the areas that we really want to focus on.
Reframe.
Yeah, reframe. Oh, perfect. I want to bring up Tom really quick. He says he agrees with me. He'd rather listen to a good conversation. He agrees with both of us. But he also said, hey, I just bought Celeste's book from 2017. We need to talk how to have conversations. And he put up your link up there. Tom Schwab is amazing. And he's a really good interview. He owns interviewvalet.com. So he's been on over 1,200 podcasts. And I just think it's neat that, what you're saying there, we need to talk. This is all powerful stuff. If I go back, Aaron Wexler has a question. Do you recommend subs transcribing interviews for content? I'm not exactly sure what that means.
I don't know either, but if the question is, do I recommend having transcriptions of interviews? Absolutely.
Okay.
It is the case that when you're doing an interview, you're having to, for the most of the time, you're having to think about how your listeners can absorb information orally. And we absorb, neurologically speaking, we absorb information very differently when we hear it than when we see it. And this is a big mistake that a lot of people make, particularly when they're writing either questions or like an intro and outro to an interview, or when you're at a panel and you're sort of saying, here's what this panel is about. Like you sit it down and you write it at your keyboard and you're writing it for the eye. But you have to then edit it by mouth. Because if it cannot be understood and absorbed through the ear, then you've done is wasted 2 minutes of intro time by writing something that your audience tunes out on. The other thing is that when your audience can't absorb the information, they literally do get distracted. They tune out and they'll start checking their phones, and it's really hard to get them back. So you always want to make sure that at every moment you're keeping it engaged. One of my editors at NPR used to say that it's like you're on a trapeze. And the listener grabs one rung, you need to make sure that next rung is there. Otherwise they fall.
Yeah.
Right. And another editor said that it's your interview or your story is like a shark, which means it has to keep moving or it dies.
Yeah. Oh, that's good advice. Brett Allen says, change my perspective on celebrity interviews. Love it.
Ugh, celebrity interviews.
Yeah. I was at, and I go back because been podcasting for a while, and I think it was 2015. I went to a podcast conference, and I got to meet Mark Maron, incredibly gifted interviewer, I would say. He brings on some amazing guests, and I was so excited to meet him. I asked him questions. And that's where I learned about asking questions that need to be open-ended as opposed to close-ended. And for those of you that don't know what that is, maybe Celeste, you can go into that. But I asked him a couple of like close-ended questions, and he literally answered yes or no. And I was like, well, this isn't good. I had an opportunity to talk with someone like Mark Maron, and I screwed it up from and this was not recorded or anything, by the way. It was just a conversation. And that was a very big lesson for me. I wonder if maybe you can go into that a little bit about the way that you can pose questions to your guests.
Right. And it's a really common mistake because we have a resistance to giving control of an interview or conversation over. It's very difficult. It's one of the things I do is I compare a conversation to a game of catch. Because in a game of catch, you can only throw exactly as many times as you catch, right? But once you let go of that ball, it's not yours anymore. And it should be the same thing in a conversation. So a closed-ended question is one in which it's basically one that could be answered in either yes or no or a very short phrase. You want to avoid those. The rule, we have somebody in public radio, and he's passed away now, but David Kandow, and he trained so many of the hosts that you hear on NPR that we knew him as the host whisperer. And he used to say, interesting question in, plain answer out. Plain question in, you get an interesting answer out. And that's it's a very generic way of saying that the shorter, the more brief, concise, and pointed question your question is, the better the answer you will be. Not, you must have been terrified. Were you scared? But how did that feel? Not, I've had some kind of experience with the Ford Mustang, and I wondered if you kind of had this feeling of power when you very first put your foot on the gas.
No.
That person, right? Then the person either says yes or no, right? As opposed to, what was it like when you first put your foot on the gas? Like, in general, open-ended questions begin with, your standards: who, what, where, when, why, or how. But you have to be very careful of some of those things. Like why can often start a question that is judgmental. Why would you think that? Why did you do that? So you have to, I'm not saying don't use why. Obviously, why is a great question, but you just have to be a little circumspect with those, as opposed to the things that start with how, what, when.
You have to be aware of context and what's happening in that conversation.
Exactly.
What do you do? And thank you for that, by the way. That was a great explanation. Right before you gave an example, I was going to say, could you give me an example? But you did that. What are some of the things you do when you feel like there's not a connection? And maybe someone, like, I've had a conversation before, and I will not name him, but his last name rhymes with Parnish. And it was very difficult to get information out of this person. I felt like he really didn't want to be there. And it was almost like he was doing a favor for a friend of mine. And I was just like, man, I'm really trying to be up and out. And so I'd switched it around. I tried to keep the communication going, but he was very short. What do you do in those situations?
There's a few things. I don't ever end my prep for an interview until I have found surprise. So I have to make sure, if I'm not going into an interview with at least 2 or 3 questions that the person has never been asked before, then I haven't finished my prep. So there's some really good and famous examples about this. For example, Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, when he very first met the Dalai Lama, his question was, when they took you to the city to be inducted as the Dalai Lama, were your parents allowed to go? And that's a really important question to ask, and also one that Dalai Lama had never been asked before. And there's examples of this throughout history of people who've never been asked questions. And this happens to me all the time. I mean, it's a calling card for me if someone says, "Oh, I've never been asked that before." That it shows an interest in their work that they normally respond to. Now, I will say there are sometimes you're going to catch someone at a bad moment, and they're just going to be a bad interview, but you can get around it to a certain extent most of the time. And I'll give you an example. People do music interviews all the time, and they never ask about music. They never ask specific questions about, what instrument do you play? If you play guitar, what kind of strings do you use? I hear a back shuffle in this particular one. Why did you do that instead of a straight 4? If you aren't a musician, you can find those questions. You can find that details, because there are always people who are examining and analyzing the songs they do. The same thing about writers. They'll ask writers about their mother and their dad and growing up in Baltimore or whatever it may be, but they never ask them about writing. Like, that's the thing they love. That's the thing they know best in the world. And so one of the exercises I make people go through is, when you're preparing to talk to a guest, and literally this preparation can take only 5 to 10 minutes if that's all you have, but you have to ask yourself, what is this person an expert in? What does this person know better than anybody else? That's what you ask them about. That's what they are always interested in talking about, because that is their passion. Yeah.
There is something you said for that. It's, as soon as you said that, I'm a big fan of YouTube. I have this, it's called ESS, Entrepreneurial Squirrel Syndrome.
Oh yeah.
That's me. So anyways, I was watching YouTube because I love studying how conversations happen on YouTube. And this particular one happened to be about Willie Nelson and Trigger. And he named his guitar Trigger. And it was so interesting, because if you ever see Willie Nelson's guitar up close, it's a classical guitar, not a regular acoustic. The strings are spread out a little bit further, but he has this big hole in it because you're not supposed to use a pick with a classical guitar. And it was just interesting learning about that. And I'm not any big musician or anything, but I like playing the guitar, and it was really interesting hearing that story, the way that those questions were posed to him, and he was very responsive.
Yeah, and there's another really good example that A.J. Liebling, who was, wrote for the New Yorker, legendary writer, and he interviewed Willie Shoemaker. Now, Willie Shoemaker was infamous for being a terrible interview. He always answered with yes or no, but Liebling opened up with one question, which was, I could be getting this not exactly right, but he said, "Why do you ride with one stirrup higher than the other?" And Shoemaker was so impressed that he'd noticed this, that he got a great interview from him. I got a great interview out of say, there's a few people who are really well known for being not enthusiastic in interviews, like like John Irving, well known for not entirely loving his book tours, and we were warned by his agent that he may not like it. But let me tell you, I went through his book with a fine-tooth comb, and one of the things I asked him, I said, look, I know you get this question all the time, but I want to read you these 2 paragraphs out of your book because I think you are writing about yourself. And he gives me this look like, oh God, here we go again. And then I read it and I explained, okay, here's why. And he goes, oh, I think you're right. I didn't realize
my book,
but I think you're right. And he went out to his agent and said, I will do an interview with her again. That's it. And the same thing happened with Toni Morrison. Like I did a Getty Fellowship, and they asked me to speak on how I got Toni Morrison to talk. And I was like, well, I read I read her stuff.
Breaking news.
Right, exactly. But it's alarming how many times that doesn't happen. The great Terry Gross, who hosts a show called Fresh Air, says she at least puts her eyeballs on every page of a book. Even if she doesn't have time to read it, her eyes touch every page. And you can take several hours to prep. You can take less than an hour to prep, but your prep doesn't end until you have a question that they've never been asked.
I love that. It is important to research. And do, and it can be challenging because I have a ton of stuff going on, but like I wanted our conversation to go well today. So I went and looked at your websites, and I went and looked at, when I had a great conversation with the other day, and I was so blessed that you would come on and share, your wisdom with so many people. And I didn't want to, for lack of a better term, F that up. I really wanted to take advantage of it and not only learn from this, but share it with others. That being said, I want to be mindful of your time and respectful of it. Aaron Wexler has a question. He says, do you recommend the framework of using the same set of questions for each guest for my podcast or book, and then having the freedom to ask other questions that come up during the interview?
If that is the conceit, in other words, if that is the way the show is, that you ask all guests the same questions, great. But that is super limited in how you do it, right? I would rather recommend, let's say you end every interview with the same 5 questions. Whatever it is, what is your biggest influence? Try not to make them the same questions everybody asks you. If you can come up with new ones, in other words, if you can come up with questions people will want to answer, then absolutely you can come up with a set of questions. The thing is that the same set of questions just aren't going to get what you want out of every guest. And I say this to people all the time because I've launched several shows. And you, especially with podcasts, you have to be careful because there are a million podcasts. And when someone has a book out, they're doing a billion interviews, right? And you want yours to be the interview that people listen to. If there are 40 interviews available of that one person, you want yours to be the one that people actually listen to. And frankly, over half of podcast listeners don't listen to the whole thing. They duck out sometime in the middle. You want yours to be so engaging that they listen all the way through to the end, which means you have to be the one that gets something out of that guest that nobody got. And that means it's going to have to be individual. It's going to have to be individualized, even if you use a portion of your show to do that sort of everyone answer the same questions thing.
Yeah. And no offense. I think everybody, Aaron, your stuff goes your way. My stuff goes my way. It's all that. It's just not a preference of mine to do anything like that. And everybody to each their own, definitely. And especially if you can nail it, by all means, go for it. But I tend to agree. I think you need to approach each conversation in a different way. You kind of have to customize every conversation for that person. And boy, I know we're getting close to time, but if there's a way, how do you find that one thing that hasn't been asked?
I honestly, I don't know the answer to that, except to say that I keep reading until I do. Most people that I'm going to interview have said stuff. Now, I very much recommend the pre-interview. And that's something I talk about in the webinar, is why you want to take the 15 minutes to do a pre-interview, what you want to ask, how you don't go too far with it, because they're only going to say it with the real, true, authentic emotion once, and you want that to be on the air. But you can do that through a pre-interview, but I just keep reading until I've found it. And if they're a person who hasn't been interviewed a lot, and therefore there's not much of their stuff to read, I start reading about their hometown. I start reading about their business that they're in. I start reading about whatever it is that they do or where they come from, until I find something that I've never heard before. I remember I was interviewing Henry Winkler, I think, and I said, hey, listen, I read this rumor on Wikipedia, and I would love it if you confirmed it, but do tell me if it's not true. Right. So, and he just cracked. I mean, Henry Winkler's always a great interview, probably one of the nicest people in the entire world. But this is how you interview with people, is you just keep looking.
I love it. And it is nice. I think finding out, like, you're in the Washington, D.C. area, it was really nice to find out kind of where you're at in the world, because that's always a good fallback, in my opinion, too. Things aren't really going right, and you need to kind of take a moment to maybe you get flustered or whatever. So hey, how's the temperature in Washington, D.C. today?
Right.
Right? It's a good way to kind of get back on track, maybe.
Absolutely. And, you'll find people have said stuff like, here's my favorite book. And so I'll be like, hey, I read that in 1982, you called such and such your favorite book. You going to stand by that? And there's all kinds of things you can get to get somebody going, and having them reading back their own words to them is often a really great way to get a good response.
Oh, amen. Well, I did want to say, Aaron Wexler, he said, thank you, really appreciate it. And Kevin Beck said, fantastic advice. So Celeste, thank you so much. And you have something coming up here. I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about it, because I know I'm going to be participating, and I hope a lot of other people do. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the webinar that you have coming up.
So I'm actually launching a once a month webinar training for interviewing, going in depth into the interview. This one coming up on the 30th, a week from yesterday, is free. This is like I'm going to spend an hour with you. I'm going to explain why you might need interview training and the kinds of things that we're going to get into. And then after that, once a month, I'll do a webinar that everybody can participate in as they like. But yeah, it's just really practical advice. Frankly, I think the best training you can always get is someone who's done it enough that they've already made almost every mistake. Right? I mean, exactly. I've made all the mistakes. Over the course of 20 years, I've made the mistakes, and I can tell you what to watch out for and how to hopefully avoid them.
Well, that's good. Aaron Wexler says he's in. So
Yay!
Where do they go?
It's 5secondstoair.com. I'm going to make sure. Yeah. 5 seconds to air. No, 5 is a number. 5 seconds to air, all one word, no spaces.com. And there's a registration there.
Perfect. So I'm going to put that up here. It's 5 seconds, plural, right? To air. Yep. .com. So it's 5secondstoair.com, and go there and sign up for it. Before we wrap up today, please don't go anywhere. Hold on one quick second, because I want to close out and then talk with you really quick after.
Sure.
But before we go anywhere, what are some parting words of wisdom you can leave for us that we can take away today and implement in our interviewing or add to our interviewing skills?
I would say that even for people who have gotten training in interviewing, almost all of that training is focused on what you're going to say and the questions you're going to ask. And we almost never get trained in how to listen, which is 50% of what makes an interview good. That's across the board. When you go to school, you get training in public speaking, but you don't get training in listening. So one of the things I really focus on is, again, listening is a skill and it can be improved. And if you're going to have a good interview, you have to be an active listener. And that means you're going to have to learn some new techniques.
Amen. I absolutely love that. One of my biggest challenges was listening. So I'm glad you brought that up. As a matter of fact, my word of the year last year was listen.
There you go.
Listen intentfully and soulfully to engage notably. So I absolutely am a fan. We have 2 ears, 1 mouth. It makes sense. Celeste, thank you so much for jumping on board today. I know you're super busy over there at NPR doing all your super important work, and it just thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this has been awesome. When is your webinar? June 30th.
June 30th at 1 p.m.
1 p.m. Just
Pretty
you
sure.
just have to go to 5secondstoair.com. Go to 5secondstoair.com and register for it there. You'll be happy you did. Celeste is absolutely incredible. Anything else you'd like to say before we wrap?
No, good luck. It's whatever you're feeling, it's honest. So it's tough to, be kind to yourself.
Ah, great words. Great words. Thank you so much. Hold on one quick second, Celeste, and we'll go ahead and wrap up. Unbelievable. We've been, let me see, we had a couple, let me see, Aaron Wexler, thank you, Jamie J, always bringing in the fresh. All right. And Frank Sell, thanks for joining. All of you, if you're just lurking around, please feel free to ask questions. I'll make sure that they get forwarded on. By all means, I cannot recommend this enough. If you have a podcast, if you have a live stream, if you're doing anything out there, even if you don't, go to 5secondstoair.com and learn about these great interview skills that Celeste will be sharing with us. She's interviewed the best of the best. She is incredible. You can listen to her on NPR. Go Google Celeste Headlee. You'll see what I'm talking about. It's absolutely amazing. And Frank Sell also said, hey, great advice. Great beard, Frank. Without any further ado, I'll go ahead and wrap today. Again, my name is Jamie J. I am the CEO and founder of Bottleneck Virtual Assistants. Of course, we were here to listen to Celeste Headlee today because she helps you stop the bottleneck in your business. And hope you really got a lot out of this. Thank you so much for stopping by, and let me know if you have any other questions. Remember, make your own ripple.